hope anyway.
We have a public hearing. Roll, Amy.
Mr. Amrine?
Here.
Mr. De Leon?
Here.
Mr. Kuhar?
Here.
Ms. Rosenberg?
Here.
Ms. Schaefer-Bish? Here. Ms. Wallach?
Here.
Okay.
Thank you. In accordance with Chapter 1111.01B1 of the Kent Codified Ordinances, this public hearing is being held to receive public comment on a proposed map amendment to the City of Kent zoning code. The City of Kent is proposing a map amendment to change the zoning of parcel number 17-046-00-00-019-007 and parcel number 17-046-00-00-018-00 from its current zoning of R2 medium density residential district to OR open space recreational district.
Okay. Any comments from the audience? Council? Okay, thank you.
This is a special council meeting. This is a special council
Yeah.
meeting. This is the first item. There's other things that are tied to church.
End of an era. All right, so we've got,
I have the same powers I have, except I wasn't meeting, but I have the same powers as council person.
Thank you.
I got them here too. Patty gave them to me. Oh, I'm sorry, hang on, three.
All I care about is that
Take the minutes of the
Hi, Robin.
eventually
minutes
becomes
from
water.
November 1.
community partners, including the Kent Junior Mothers, Kent State University, both the fire and the police departments, Kent City Schools, Metis Construction, Davey Tree, and the Parks and Recreation, just to name a few, all wanting to participate in this project to make a permanent little village. And I've got kind of some some mock renderings here, if you can see. These have done several different shows throughout the summer, so they're a little beat up. I apologize. So the idea is to have permanent structures. You may be familiar with Stowe's Safety Town, located on Fish Creek Road, right by the Red Park. The purpose, obviously, is to create a safe place for not just kids, but all community members, to learn about safety programs, particularly street, crossing safety, things that are really important for younger children to learn, but also a space that could be potentially used for ongoing safety programs throughout the year, beyond kind of the classic, stoplight, stop sign sort of safety. So we're trying to build momentum. At the moment, we're in the process of having that site. It's already been surveyed. The Rotary Club of Kent sponsored that, as is the site engineering work, which should be completed soon. And then we hope to go into kind of the money raise side of it. The property's owned by Kent City Schools. They've graciously agreed to use this property for this purpose. There's still some hurdles to clear. It's far from a completed deal. We're seeking more involvement, so anything that council or other city departments could do to help is extremely appreciated, but we're excited about the possibility of having something we can be really proud of here in Kent for Safety Town. Happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Heidi?
Yeah, I know the site. It's set back a little bit behind a building. I know that there might be a parking available as a result, but I know the Stowe's one, you drive by and you can see it. It's really cool. How would you make sure that people know what it is and know that it exists?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some good signage in front of what the schools call the Columbus Building. It's that brick building right there on Franklin. And maybe some other signs at other intersections that could point people towards it. But certainly we'd want to promote it through local sources like the Portager and other things, and let people know that there's a nice space that's there and walkable for people who live in that neighboring community. But also whether it's the parking lot that you mentioned or lots of street parking with all the new curbing that city's done the last few years in that neighborhood. Lots of available street parking as well. So it is set back. That will be kind of a challenge, but we'll do everything we can to put it out there and let people know about it.
Thank you.
Further questions? Robin?
Yeah. How do you feel council may be of assistance in promoting, or from any number of ways, aspects, the overall agenda of what you're trying to accomplish? What can we do, you think, right now, based on how we function?
It's a great question. I wish I had a drop list here of asks to council. I think at the moment, making you all aware of this project, it's still relatively in its infancy. And I don't pretend to know all the powers that City Council has, but I'm sure there are ways in which council can either help promote it. Perhaps there's city services. I did meet on site with Jim Bowling and another individual whose name escapes me. Talked about maybe signage within the Safety Town, maybe some of the street elements. So the idea is that businesses would sponsor the building parts and maybe other pieces within the Safety Town, the park really. But there's probably a lot of more of the hard elements of this, because really at the end of the day it's a park. And I think there's some ways that through the city's resources, both in knowledge and other resources beyond that, can kind of add to the list of partners and have City Council beyond that list, and help kind of turn it from a drawing board into a reality. So that's a long-winded answer of saying I don't exactly know, but I'm certain there's some positive energy that could be put towards it.
Okay. Further, John?
Yeah, who owns that property now? Does the city own it?
The Kent City Schools.
Kent City Schools owns it, okay.
Roger?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to add a couple things. When David met with Tom Larkin, the superintendent of schools, and myself, we had a little bit of sit-down because it was, he asked a legitimate question. I think anytime there's a new project that really has, you know, it started out as an idea about a year ago, I would think, and then all of a sudden it started to gain momentum, and just like any other project, what happens with that momentum, those of us who are a little older realize that sometimes you have to do some strategic things. David wanted to talk with council tonight strategically to say, okay, here's where we're at, and Tom and I both kind of chuckled about the fact that exactly what Robin's question was exactly what David was struggling with as to, okay, so now what will the schools do? How does Kent State help? When Melanie heard about it, Melanie came right to me and said, listen, we want to do the signs. And so we need to continue, I think, to have David and his committee, because he has a large committee, to look at what might we do. Yes, I think that's the things that we talked about, and Tom, so.
Okay. Further? John?
Yeah, so you get this little town build up there. I guess my question is, how much use will it get? It would be like a bus ride to the fire station, or?
So annually, every summer, there's the actual safety school program that the Kent Junior Mothers run. That's just a one-week program currently. They've hopped all over town at various elementary schools using their parking lot, basically, and kind of setting up a temporary road and doing it using some classroom space. So I think there's some opportunities to expand that program. But when I met with both Chief Shearer and Chief Myers, we talked about some of the year-round learning opportunities that could kind of be hosted at a safety town. Not, again, specifically just for children, but bike safety for adults, other programs beyond just, you know, physical street safety, but you know, informational sessions that could be, you know, there at the park for all ages. So kind of use it as a beacon of safety in all aspects of the word.
So then the multiple schools in the community can like timeshare their week to utilize the facility for their
I imagine so. Yeah, absolutely. The property would remain owned by the Kent City Schools, so I think they'd be eager to have their various elementary schools and other programs use that park.
Further from council? Anyone from the audience wish to speak on this? Just this was just an informational, somebody, yes.
You got to come up to the microphone.
Come on up, please. I'll give your name, address for the records, please.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is James Stadelman. I live at 1157 Windward Lane in Kent. I've been to other safety towns, and one of the things that some of them have, the one at Stowe is primarily small buildings, and it does exactly what you were describing. But I've been to some other ones, and what they do is they make at least one building a little bit larger than the others, and they incorporate some things that would be, if, for example, if there were to be a fire in the house, what would the people do? They use it for training. And what they do is that if there's a door, what they do is they put an electric heater in the door such that if there's supposed to be a fire, they teach the children to go up and put their hand on the door before they open it so that they don't open it up into a big flame kind of thing. So they teach them things like that. Also, they have a fireman come by in full gear so that if a child sees somebody that looks like they're from outer space, they don't get afraid and go hide in a closet in case there's an issue. So there are other, I wondered if you had any conversations with, let's say, Medina or, you know, other people to see what kind of things they've incorporated in theirs so that you could consider, you know, maybe making one, like say, one building a little bit larger than the other ones. Most of the other ones are relatively short, which are great for showing things on the street. But if you had something like that, it might be helpful. So I just offer it as a question.
Well, that's a good suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. No more questions? Appreciate it, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, the next thing on the Committee of the Whole agenda is update on the City Administration Building. Melanie?
Back there.
So I'm pretty excited to be here. I was kind of a little disappointed the last two times I came because I didn't feel like we were moving very much. But I'm really pleased to inform everybody.
Push that nose.
Could you forward that for me, please?
You have to push it?
Oh, there it is.
There you go.
Yeah, I did it without even doing it.
So, if you've noticed, our exterior continues to go up. The window framing is in place, and we're waiting for the glass. The glass was actually delivered to the site today.
Ooh.
So I'm very, very excited about that because they will begin next week totally enclosing that first floor. As you can see, as you look at these windows, you can see all of the aluminum framing in order to hold the glass, and then the glazing will come when they actually place the glass in there. A longer process than I had ever anticipated, so you order yours out and delivered to the facility. They come out, they do their measurement, they do their cutting, and then they come back out when the framing is to do their final measurements as well. So a little bit of a process, but pretty exciting that we're getting there. This is a look from the inside out, now that all of the framing is up, ready to hold the glass. And to me, I just think like this is going to be like the coolest look coming out off of that top floor to look out into this area. The other two are looking obviously inside of the building, but again, you just can begin to see the detail, how it's going to look, how exciting. Again, transparency was key to this project, and you can honestly begin to see now, people are going to be able to see from all angles inside of this building. So it's extremely exciting to see this as we continue to move forward. If you've noticed, they have enclosed on that first floor with plastic. They're able to have some temporary heat. Our gas meter will actually be set next week, so we'll be able to turn the gas on and keep the building heated. We're doing this because, as you'll notice in the next one, we have done as much drywalling as we can on the upper part so that it doesn't get wet, but we're going to begin doing drywalling on the bottom. So as I said, the drywall is up on the top of the walls, and we're beginning to enclose the upper areas. The first floor is being temporarily enclosed, and drywall will start there. So you'll really begin to be able to see what those rooms are going to start looking like. So it's going to really come together fast once they do that. The good news about this is everything is installed, electric, HVAC, all of our conduits, and we've gotten all of our approvals. So we're able to go ahead and start enclosing. This is actually a view from the top of the building looking down on our transformer and dumpster location. I know everybody's like, why would she show us that? Our transformer is key to this building for us to be able to get going on this. And so we have power that's going to be new, a brand new transformer that's going to be set within this area. Then the dumpsters go on the other side. Our large conduit's been installed over to this area. And we, of course, have connectivity back to this building, which is kind of where our IT lives and breathes, between this building and the police building. So we're pretty excited as to how this is going. There'll be a large area in front of those dumpsters for ease of access and then safety for that area. The final item that we have that we just learned of today is that our cast stone was also delivered yesterday. And that is the stone that actually goes up around the top, around our windows, and begins to really offset what that brick is going to look like. So in the next month or so, you'll begin to see what that contrast is. You'll begin to see the different colors. We have, as you know, that very darker brick that kind of begins to offset the red brick. And again, when you look at it in conjunction of coming down South Water Street and you look at the downtown, you begin to see how our building looks in. And if you come up over the Haymaker Bridge, this is really going to be a spectacular building. It is the head of your municipal complex, and I think it's really going to shine when you have that, because then you have the great fire station behind it, and then right behind that again is another fabulous structure, which is our police department. So I'm very pleased with how it's going. I'm excited to have brought this report to you. Again, I felt a little down the last two times because I just didn't feel like I was seeing some change, but this is really spectacular, and as things are beginning to be delivered, it's exciting, and we should be able to see things move just a little bit faster.
Thanks, Melanie. Questions for Melanie? John, did you have a question? No. Any questions? Anybody from the audience? Thank you, Melanie, appreciate it.
Thanks, Melanie.
Okay, Land Use Committee, Mr. Ferrara?
I will call to use the Land Use Committee, but before I do, it's nice to know, Melanie, that you do windows. Thank you. First item is rezoning on Johnson Road. Bridget?
Get your squeegee.
Look at you. Must be your last job.
Come on, Bridget.
Didn't want your last committee chair for land use to not have a zoning item. Here I am with a map.
It's how I dreamed it would be.
We planned it. We had a lawsuit filed just in time for us to get it. So I am here before you with a map amendment request. This deals with the 2 parcels that have now been consolidated on Johnson Road, south of Johnson Road, north of Forest Lake subdivision. This was the 2 parcels that was before you in May, where the petitioner had requested the detachment of lands to move those parcels into Franklin Township. Council denied that request after significant public input. The petitioner filed in the Court of Common Pleas, and as a result of that, outside counsel and myself met with their counsel and the petitioner, and through mediation, it was offered that we could actually change the zoning, do the map amendment to open space recreational, which would allow him to utilize those parcels for an agricultural use, which was what he had indicated here at council. I think he used the word a gentleman farmer, as well as what he listed in mediation. The terms of the mediation are that if the rezone happens, if the map amendment moves forward by January 19th, the case will be dropped in the court. This was presented to the Planning Commission. We had extensive representatives from residents from Forest Lakes here. Actually, we had, I knew you were going to be here. He's actually also been on speed dial with me on this matter. But as I explained extensively at Planning Commission, to not approve the map amendment and modify this and amend it, I should say amend it to open space recreational, will allow this to move to Franklin Township, which means the city does not have control over the zoning. I would also like to point out that that means too that while they have a rural residential designation, if it were to go that way, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be rezoned. So by moving forward with this map amendment to move from an R2 to an OR, the property owner gets to utilize the property in the manner he has reported he would like to without any additional requirements. I will say though, it is in the flood plain, so he is still subject to the FEMA rules, whether he was in the city or within the township, and he is aware of that. That was also discussed at mediation and in subsequent discussions. This was presented to Planning Commission, and as I mentioned, we had significant representation from the neighborhood. I do think after that session, everyone understood, and Planning Commission voted unanimously to recommend council approve the map amendment to transition from R2 to OR.
Questions from council? Ms. Wallach?
So let me see if I heard this right. So the zoning designation is a change, but the parcel is still going to be considered in the city of Kent?
Correct.
Okay.
It will stay within our zoning. It'll just allow for the agricultural use.
Right. So things like target practice with weapons and things will not be allowed to do?
So they're conditionally permitted uses. So the agriculture is a permitted use. If in the my memo that I presented, if you look at the open space recreational, the permitted uses are uses. He still would have to check with us depending on the nature of those, but those would be allowed. And then the conditionally permitted uses are uses that would need to come before the Planning Commission for site plan review and approval.
Further, Ms. Wallach?
Nope.
Mr. Kuhar?
So the allowance of agricultural uses and that, couldn't you do them before?
Not in an R2. You can do them in an R1, but you could not do them in an R2. And the use that there was a lot of anecdotal information about proposed use, about outdoor recreational, that is actually allowed conditionally in an R2 as well. So this actually allows for the larger agricultural use that
What are
he
some of
wanted.
the examples of
Farming,
just like, what's the difference?
livestock.
Okay, so livestock, so gardening would be approved either way, but
Right,
not farming
right,
commercially, okay.
Well, livestock, you could not have it in R2, no.
Right.
You could not. Well, if you had 2 acres, I suppose you could get the.
Chickens,
Yeah.
you have chickens.
Yeah. Or if they're emotionally support cattle, you could.
Or
get-
donkey, or donkeys.
We actually do have 2 emotionally support
Yes, we-
burros, they're burros, not done.
Thank you, President.
Yeah.
Further, Mr. Guar?
No.
Mr. Turner?
That was enough.
Yeah, so there was a finding of fact on this? What was rationale that we, as council, made a determination on our position that we would not allow him to
Detach.
Can I jump in there real quick? I was going to bring this up anyways. So what she said, but didn't harp on it, you are correct. You said, you know, we're not going to do anything. But the do-nothing option resulted in a lawsuit. And I remember very early on, Hope put us in contact with an attorney who's done these. There's not a ton of these. We hadn't seen a detachment before. But put us in contact with an attorney, and the first thing he said was, you know, cities pretty much always lose this. You won't win. So as a result of that, he, working, as she said, with her and their attorney, went into mediation voluntarily and came out with this, you know, agreement that seemed to satisfy, to the extent that it can, the best of both sides. It's not perfect, but it seems pretty fair on both sides. So I wanted to mention that was actually, it wasn't just, oh, we want to do this. It was, we're going to lose it in court. It just, that's the precedents have been very clear on this.
Historically, there have only been 4 cases of detachment of lands petitions filed in the court since 1950. So it is not something that is seen often. And this was one of the only cases, or the second case, that involved platted lands. So there was, I will say, the outside counsel did an excellent job of pointing out how this was statutorily different than in some other sections of that chapter. And I think that's what convinced the other side. And in addition to that, they were also seeking, one of the things that the petitioner and their attorney said was that the city of Kent requires additional permitting for agricultural use. We do not. The definition of agriculture in our zoning code is Chapter 119 of the Ohio Revised Code. So we were able to show them that by staying in the city and moving forward with this map amendment to open space recreational, he would still be able to utilize the land that he purchased in the manner that he is presented he would like to do. Meanwhile, the city gets to continue monitoring the zoning, which is something that allows us to ensure that the residents that abut that property have some awareness of what is happening, and the city would control that zoning.
Then, in the conversations you've had with the affected residents, they are, I know, there's more of a consensus situation, probably, than, you know, although maybe it is unanimous because they know that we really can't win or don't have any.
I will say that at Planning Commission, we had, Jim, would you say maybe 25, 30 people here? And I think by the end of that discussion, it was more, there was a lot of explaining zoning, site plan, all those things, and what would happen if it transitioned into the township. And many of them, I believe, were satisfied. We stayed after, I stayed after and answered additional questions for another half an hour. And the fact that we only had, I think Jim's just here because he's going to report back to everybody else the results of what happens tonight. We have basically residents from one household compared to when we had about 20. So I do believe this is satisfactory. As I explained, this allows, it's a balance. It allows the property owner should have the right to do something on property they own, but it has to be balanced within the confines of the abutting properties. So this, I think, is a balance, and I do think it is an appropriate result of the mediation that we were in.
Mr. DeLong?
So, no firing range for guns? Okay.
No, well, we don't allow that in the city of Kent.
You don't allow that in the city of Kent?
Correct.
Then there's no way he could do that?
No, it's the city of Kent.
All right.
We can have Chief Shearer affirm that, but no.
Well, I was just saying,
Yeah.
I didn't know what you guys talked about. That's why I asked.
No, anything that would be prohibited in the city of Kent would be prohibited on this land. And the conditionally permitted uses that are listed, which include that outdoor recreation use, which was something that was a matter of consternation for many of the residents. Is it conditionally permitted use? And as I explained to the residents that night, it's not just the use. So to say that they want to put a water park, I'm going to use that because that is what has been tossed around. That is not something the city is saying happened. I want to clarify that at the microphone. But as that example, there are requirements. Parking, ingress, egress, you can't do certain things in the floodplain. So staff would be going through all of those requirements before it would even get to the point where it could go forward to Planning Commission. And because of I included the map, you can see how extensive that floodplain is in that area. It is highly unlikely that the use that has been anecdotally rumored that might occur there would even be an option through the conditionally permitted process or even through FEMA.
But if it would have went to Franklin Township, he could have put some kind of firing range, right?
We would have no control over how it was zoned.
Okay.
All I know is with their RR, their rural recreational use, it did limit, and I actually informed the zoning person about this, non-motorized boats.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Further questions from council?
My question.
Questions from the audience? Back to council.
I'll move to approve with the emergency.
Second.
All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion passes. Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you.
And now we're going to move on to the design guidelines update.
Yes. So this is the final draft of the design guidelines. I had forwarded them earlier, and I also listed, we did have extensive discussions and reviews. The Planning Commission discussion was delayed because of illness. We did not have a quorum, so that discussion did not happen until September. And then we had pretty extensive agendas in October and November, so that's why we're here today. We took all the public comments we received, which I had presented to you in a memo in May, and that is actually, again, reiterated in the November 27th. And we went through all of the sections. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this historic preservation, because just with some dialogue I had with some members of council beforehand, I think we need some clarity. Historic preservation, that term, and this is historic building, are thrown around a lot. The city has a definition for a historic, and that is in Chapter 1393. It is not in the planning or zoning process. It is not part of the zoning code, nor is it part of the Architectural Review Board regulations. It is in 1393. So what happened is Main Street Kent did design guidelines, which were presented to the city. Initially, those were adopted by the city as basically, they were only going to be required if there was going to be some kind of incentive from the city to the property owner. They were codified in 2011 with a historic preservation focus. In 2012, for Ron Burbick, the city went forward with the Historic Preservation Ordinance, which is the 1393. However, when Jim Silver went to go out and establish a historic district, the property owners, no one but Ron, wanted it. So this draft allows for a historic property to be designated by consent of the property owner, or in a district, 50% of the property owner. That is the city's definition of a historic property. Now, there is historic definitions from the State Historic Preservation Office. The Kent Historical Society can establish rules as a nonprofit for theirs, but regulatory in the city, the definition is in 1393. And I will tell you, I have read more design guidelines in the last few months. Those that do have them, not every community has a design guideline. They specify what defines a historic district, what defines a historic property. So I want to make sure that you understand that's why I put this in here, because we have to define it. We can't tell people they're in a historic property if they haven't asked for it, based on the city's passed and approved regulations from 2012, written and based on the State Historic Preservation Office ordinance that was given to Jim Silver and I to utilize. So I want to clarify that. And then there has been questions that came up about demolition. Demolition also is in other chapters. It's basically included in part of our building code, and there's requirements for that. But in 1393, it also says if it's a local designated historic property, and remember, for it to be locally designated, the property owner has to request it. The Committee on Design and Preservation has to approve it, and then council has to authorize it. 3 steps happen in order for that to meet the definition based on the model we used from the State Historic Preservation Office. Demolition requires consent of the property owner for a locally designated property. So people bring up the Robin Hood all the time. It was historic. It was significant in this community. It was, first of all, this ordinance, the 2012 ordinance of Chapter 1393 was passed in 2012, and the Robin Hood was taken down. Even then, if that owner hadn't designated it, it would not have fallen under this chapter. Did that help explain some of the questions that came up before? So based on that, that is why item, go ahead.
So can I just jump in there? So that's important because, and I was here, and I think Bridget was part of it too back then, and when she mentioned Jim Silver, when we were doing the certified local government and having those discussions in council, Jim Silver reported, council asked about the historic district concept, and Jim said there has not been any support for that and actually resistance. And you guys still had the opportunity at that time to say, hey, do we want to impose that or not? And then you all said, I'm not going to impose something onto the business property owners if they don't want it. Why don't we make it so that if they want to do it, great, come on, bring it on, but I'm not going to impose it on them. And you were very clear at that time. That has been the basis for everything we've done since then. And why that becomes important is a lot of the comments that we've heard at the end of the design guideline update is basically trying to go back to that previous decision. Even though you said no historic district, people are asking for insertion of items that basically would be if you had a historic district. You don't have one. So that's why you don't see a lot of that language in the design guidelines. Now, if you want to revisit that, that's on you, and we can change all that. But I think it's sort of like we got to be careful not to try to fit a round peg through a square hole. You chose a square hole. Other people might want a round peg, but they may not line up, and we shouldn't necessarily try to have a surrogate decision in the design guidelines to try to use that to get back to that decision, I guess.
And this, in 1393, it talks not only about how a single local if a property is designated historic, but a historic district. 51% of the property owners, we did not have that. And Jim Silver's proposed district was much, much smaller than the overlay district that currently is used for the design guidelines that are currently codified in our zoning code. And the reason he did shrink that was so that we could hopefully get that district designated for Ron Berwick's project, so we could get the tax credits, and also because he knew we needed to meet that 51%, and that it was very large and significant. But even with that small, and I have the map, I've got all the memos, I have shared this information numerous times, it still didn't get approved. 51% of those people did not. So as the guidelines say, if interested parties, ad hoc group, want to get a historic district, they can, but they have to get 51% of the property owners in that district to agree. And then at that point, it goes to the Committee on Design and Preservation, not the Architectural Review Board. The State Historic Preservation Office requires it go to the Committee on Design and Preservation. They then vote and make a recommendation to council. Council then authorizes that historic district. That is the process. It has not changed in 11 years. It's always been on the books. But often, we are hearing about the historic. So we basically had design guidelines created by an outside entity that were historic preservation in focus, adopted and codified into our zoning code in 2011. In 2012, the year after, the city rejected a historic district. So we were basically inherently conflicted because we have historic preservation design guidelines, but we don't have a historic district. And that is why the design guidelines have been so controversial and seem to be challenging. I also want to add that for those that have historic preservation guidelines, Hudson, been in place since 1973, that district. Talmadge, 1971. Chagrin Falls, 1974. Ours, 2011. Our guidelines went in 2011 without a district. There's a difference. 40, 50 years of a historic downtown with a historic district designated and recognized at either the state or federal level is completely different than we don't have a district, but we had historic preservation guidelines. And that has been the challenge and the issues. And while I appreciate that people have stood at this microphone and said that developers did not have a problem with it, 110 million of building out there was not done without me getting yelled at a lot after denials and the shifting of goalposts by the Architectural Review Board in the development of that downtown. So I just wanted to get all that history out there for anyone that isn't aware.
Well, and if I could even just finish that thought. Ironically, today I was doing the pending list update. We try to do that in January. And if you look on that pending list, the design guidelines are on that. And that was back in June of '21, council moved that. And if you remember, if I actually look at the notes in that, that was because you were getting asked to arbitrate problems between the Architectural Review Board and property owners. Mike Beater was one of them, Ron Burbick was one of them, and there were others that were very vocal and very stressed. There's some of the people that would yell at Bridget because she's trying to play the mediator in between those two parties. And that's in part why council said, well, we need to revisit these guidelines because this tension, this isn't an effective way to do both things that we want to do, which is promote preservation of buildings, but still allow, as Bridget mentioned, property owner rights to be able to do things within our downtown. And so let's not forget that there was that tension was, and what she's speaking to is exactly what you started to get stuck in the middle of, which is why we started this. And it's been 2.5 years now of public meetings, all kinds of comments, and in meetings in here. So
Those things were not brought to you because it was our job, Dave and myself, to get that project done and move it forward. So rather than ending up in court with the developer, we would work very hard to get them to try to understand. I tried to hold the Architectural Review Board, like, you know, if they were coming back to talk about a balcony and then they started transitioning to go back towards an entranceway, I'm like, no, we're back, we're focusing just on the balcony. There was a shifting of goals. There's subjectivity in the design guidelines that were codified, and they were historic. There was a lot of challenges, a lot of challenges. So as I go through this, you'll see some of the reasoning as to why, because of those challenges are reflected in this, why we are, at the end of the day, asking that the design guidelines not be codified and be recommendations only. So I went through items 1, 2, and 3, or 1 and 2 on the historic preservation. So if you have questions on that, we can revisit it, but I'm hoping we understand that that is completely separate and distinct and that we do not have a district. Also, item number 3 that was brought up was adaptive reuse was not addressed. We did add adaptive reuse to the building design section of the attached draft and recommended that. I will tell you that it is very standard right now for adaptive reuse, especially in an established existing community, but it was a good point that it should have been, you know, pointed out, and so that people do think about it. The question of demolition was not addressed. Again, I had already talked about that. We have it in our building code, but it is addressed in 1393, and it is only a matter that needs to go before the Committee on Design and Preservation for consideration if the property owner has gone through the formalized process of getting it designated as historic. If it is not designated as historic, under what the Kent codified ordinance say, it is not considered historic, and the property owner does not have to go through that process. When they are designated, 8 properties we have, I believe, designated, any of those, if they were up to become, if they came in to pull a demolition permit, they would be going back in front of the Committee on Design and Preservation. But if they are not designated through that local process, then they would not. Then there was a...
Bridget,
yes.
Mr. Sidoti, quick question.
Can I ask a question about
Sure.
that? So, as we walk through town and we see significant historical buildings, and the property owner wants to come in and wants to tear that building down, there's no way we can stop that if it's a significant historical building.
If they have gotten it designated, for
Well,
example...
what if they haven't, though? That's what I'm saying.
No.
So-
It's private property rights.
So anyone could come into this community and buy what we would all recognize as a historical building, but it hasn't been designated as such, and they could just tear that building down.
Correct. Residential or commercial.
I don't believe that a lot of our citizens understand that.
Yeah.
I think they think that we can stop that.
We
and,
cannot.
We cannot. Okay.
Does it
Jay
change
Leon?
does it change with ownership?
No, I mean, if it's been designated, the property is designated. So, you know, the On-Us building that's over on Gogler, designated. Ken Stage, designated. Ken Hotel, designated. So those have been designated. So if Tom Simpson were to sell or the water facility were to change, then it is still a designated, and it's been filed with the State Historic Preservation Office. So that local designation process that goes through the Committee on Design and Preservation, after the owner requests it, it goes to that committee, it comes to council, I'm sure many of you remember those designations, and then I formally send that to Nathan Bevel at the State Historic Preservation Office. So it cannot, it is official. But those are the only ones based on the way our ordinance is written, and this model is based on the fact that we require owner consent, which is modeled after the State Historic Preservation Office's ordinance that they sent to Jim Silver. So.
Okay.
Mr. Sidoti?
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, you want to go, Tracy? I was just curious, so if, obviously people are watching and listening to what we're talking about, it's always a matter of public record. So if they want to do that, where do they initiate the process?
They just contact the Community Development Department.
And then
they submit a letter basically saying why, and historic can be, some of our historic designation has not been associated with the year of the building, it's just been something that's like, you know, it has meaning, you know.
Significant.
Significance, right, local significance is allowed. So they would submit a letter. Davey actually did one for the building on Bryce, their small building on Bryce. It's not, you know, really anything other significant than for them it was. Went through that process, the Committee on Design and Preservation recommended to council, council designated it, so they would not be able to tear that down, because that is filed with the State Historic Preservation Office now as locally designated historic property in the city of Kent.
One follow up, just a quick
Sure.
follow-up. So let's take the Huntington Bank building as an example. That hasn't been designated as a historic
No, it has
building.
not.
Okay, so the current owners would have to be the ones that petition for
Correct.
that to happen.
That is correct.
And the only advantages for them doing that would be what?
To seek historic tax credits, which is why Ron went through that process for the old hotel.
Ms. Wallach, you had a question?
Yeah, I don't know if this is in the flow, but I wanted to ask you, so only historically designated buildings have to submit to acceptance by the Committee on Design and Preservation? I mean, is that the process? They go to Design and Preservation when they want to do something, and then they have to get an okay from them?
Yeah.
And then where does the Architectural Review Board come in then?
They're not part of this.
So they're not part of this at all? So
No.
people don't even have to go to them anymore?
The Committee on Design and Preservation was established in 2012, and I will tell you, Nathan Bevel told me, you have an inherent conflict, because you have the Committee on Design and Preservation that is doing historic preservation, but you have an Architectural Review Board that is using guidelines that are historic, but you don't have a historic district. So every time I hand in my 2-year report, he questions that.
So does the Architectural Review Board then look at things that are in the overlay district?
Yes.
So
But
they
the
are
overlay district's not a historic district.
Right, so that's kind of a different type of thing.
And that's what I've been using. I've been saying, well, they look at the overlay district, and yeah.
Okay, so any of these things, any of these recommendations, any of these heavily discouraged things, those are all only going to be under the Committee of Design and Preservation?
No, the Committee on Design and Preservation are the ones that statutorily can designate a local property. The Architectural Review Board would be the design guideline draft that's before you, and currently has the authority for certificate of appropriateness out of the ones that are currently adopted in the zoning code.
So I've been looking at these, and these are also kind of vague. There aren't any specifics.
Correct.
Like there aren't any numbers, like the windows have to be this big by that big or something. So are these specific enough, though, if somebody takes them to court, that they can be defended?
I will get to that in these items, but I can speak to that now. So the issue is, the consultant calls them standards, we call them regulations. They are our zoning code. The zoning code is our regulations. It has that specificity of height, distance, egress, ingress, everything. We spent over 2 years rewriting over 200 pages of that code based on all of the challenges and issues we found in there. Gary wrote and adopted the code in 2011 that codified the design guidelines, of which he was concerned about because they lacked that specificity that the front part of the zoning code had. It had that detail, it had that specificity. They did not. And that was a concern because you've just codified it, you made it a regulation. So what happens with that is you're having a subjective item that has the authority of a regulatory position. So it created this inherent conflict. So if there is something that the Architectural Review Board or the community wants to be, we don't want internally lit lights in the central, the CD zoning district. We codify that. We go through a text amendment, which is according to our code, presented to the Planning Commission. They make a recommendation to council, it comes to council, it is adopted, and then it goes into the zoning code. And then it's very clear. We prohibit internally lit signs in the downtown CD district. So if you go through our zoning code, it has all that specificity. Size, lighting, all of that. The guidelines did not, that are currently in our zoning code. And that has been the challenge. That, plus that they're historic, and we don't have historic, so we had all these inherent conflicts. So the consultant did craft standards, but they don't know our zoning code. Like, the first one was that the buildings, they should be set back. No. Our community, our CD, we require you to build right up on the parcel line. So that's why I told them, we did not hire you to write standards. We wrote standards. Staff spent 2.5 years writing standards. And I will tell you, we're 2 years in, they work pretty well. We have found a couple that didn't, and I've come back with text amendments, but overall, because they came through basically the fact that we had $385 million of investment between 2011 and 2018. That taught us a lot of what works and what doesn't. So that zoning code has all those regulations, which I'm going to continue to call regulations and not standards, because it seems to confuse people. So, and these, in the guidelines, are guidelines. They are encouragement for style and approach and a look, but it is not codified. If we want to codify something, if we really want something, that we want to make sure that every first floor in a zoning district or the overlay district have this much glass, then we should put it in the zoning code as a regulation. And to be clear, another question that came up, and I saw your email, Mr. Fuller, so I'll speak to this. You cannot have the Architectural Review Board and the Planning Commission review regulations and guidelines. The Planning Commission is in our charter. It is actually in the Ohio Revised Code. They do site plan review. You know what comments they had? None. They don't deal with the guidelines. They look at site plan. And they are the ones that approve amendments to the zoning code. The Architectural Review Board uses the guidelines and issues a certificate of appropriateness. So the Architectural Review Board is not in our charter, and it is not in the Ohio Revised Code.
Ms. Schaefer-Bish.
Yes, so my question. So if they issue a certificate of appropriateness based on recommended guidelines, and the property owner says, well, I don't want to follow those guidelines, so would they still be able to deny that certificate of appropriateness?
That would be the next question, and that goes under the basically the roles and responsibilities you want to assign to a board. So we are recommending that the design guidelines that are currently in the code be stricken because of the conflict and the issues and the concerns we have and experience, and that these be adopted as a recommendation. The next step with regards to what the roles and responsibilities or how those are administered falls under the purview of a board decision, and that is all a council decision.
So that is, like you're saying, that is something we need to revisit or visit
based on
again.
whatever is determined on how you want to handle these guidelines. If they become recommendations, the next step, potentially of probably a future committee meeting, would be how will those be administered. I can tell you that there was a architectural advisory board, and they met with developers and made basically recommendations, but there was no certificate of appropriateness required for that process, nor were they required to get that certificate right now, because the way it's done, the certificate of appropriateness is required before they can go they have to get that before they can go through Planning Commission, through that whole process of moving a project forward. So it is the first step. Under a recommendation guideline where it was before, which actually there weren't guidelines, the Architectural Advisory Board basically was a group that met with developers and discussed site plans and made recommendations. There was no issuance of any formalized documentation from the city. There were minutes. They did take minutes of the meetings, and the developers, took the comments, and many did incorporate those, but it wasn't a formalized certificate of appropriateness issued.
Thank you.
Mr. Sidoti,
Yeah.
or you have a follow-up? You have a follow-up?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
We're good.
So, then on the penalty that you have listed here of the dollar amount, that only applies to historically designated?
That's $13.93. That has
Right.
nothing to
Okay.
do with the design guidelines,
And
correct?
then, suppose somebody comes into town and they want to put a hot pink border around their business in the downtown area. They would be allowed to do that because these guidelines are simply recommendations.
Right. Well, right now, we don't actually, in the current guidelines that are actually codified in the zoning code, we don't control color. It's been handled subjectively through discussions with the Architectural Review Board on what colors can and cannot move forward. So the CT consultants did suggest that perhaps we limit it to a palette of 4, but so I've been spending a lot of time on this. I've walked through Chagrin, I've walked through Hudson, I walked downtown and looked at the Zephyr and Tacotanos. We're not limiting colors. So we had a situation, for example, where Mike Beater, out of frustration, after being denied the certificate of appropriateness because he was selling Kent State gear, and he basically painted that trim with the blue and the gold, was denied by the Architectural Review Board. He came here to appeal it because it's codified, and there was no other recourse for him to do. So it becomes a slippery slope. It's, you know, I still remember Ron Burbick with the colors for Trano. That also created some challenges. So we don't have colors in the current design guidelines, but they are, because they have the statutory authority of not approving a project without with a certificate of appropriateness. If they deny that, that project can't go forward, right? They cannot get anything from the rest of our department. They can't go site plan, they can't go get a zoning use certificate, they can't open. But we don't define color. Those decisions were made by a group, through a group discussion of the Architectural Review Board. So I think the fact that we have those colors, and bright colors and variety, and in Chagrin Falls, they paint the buildings. I stood right in front of a 1800-some building that's on the top, 1877, red. Attached facades. They let them paint that red for a clothing store. Then there's a big pink sign for ice cream. So it can work. It looks great, quite honestly. So I just think that you're going down a slippery slope if you start regulating color if we already have the colors out there. I mean, Zephyr is bright. Those colors have been on there forever.
Mr. Sidoti, you had a question?
Yeah, so Bridget, it sounds like that with some cleaning up, that at some point, anyone will be able to go into the guidelines and on specific areas be able to hit a hyperlink that will take us directly to the codified ordinance that.
Well, the zoning code.
Well, the zoning code, that's right.
Not the guidelines.
No, not the guidelines.
Right, the zoning
But
code.
if you look at the
We have
guidelines,
it.
yeah.
You can do that
So
now.
is there any possible way of taking all those specifics that are the absolute no-nos that we set and add an addendum or
No,
to the
because they vary
guidelines?
by zoning district.
Oh.
It's over 200 pages.
Oh.
Signs alone, that chapter alone is 40 pages. That's one of our biggest chapters.
But there aren't there-
Landscaping,
So in
another
other words,
chapter.
so for just the overlay district though, could we have any kind of a?
Well,
this-
the overlay district is not a zoning district. It's an overlay over
Of
multiple
multiple
zoning
districts.
districts.
But
So the
each one of
zoning
those districts-
regulations below it still apply.
Okay. Okay. So the next, I'm sorry, can I
Go ahead.
follow up? So the next step would be then, because as you said, in the charter, we are the ones who determine what boards do, and there is no architectural review board in our charter, but we have chosen to have one. So we have to decide how they're going to address, or who's going to address when an individual looks at these design guidelines and said, screw it, I'm not going to follow any of these.
Right.
What happens?
Well, I want to remind people,
Yeah.
not every community has design guidelines. We have design guidelines because they were presented to the council in 2010 as something that they should add to the zoning code. Now, I was not part of that process, You know, anecdotally, I know of some of it, but again, they were codified. They were put in the zoning code. And I will say, the director at that time did not want that to happen because of the subjectivity of it and because we didn't have the historic district. And so that now it is a requirement. But those design guidelines do not necessarily need to be codified. There are communities that have them. There's communities that have them as recommendations. A developer comes in. These are the zoning code requirements. These are a must, right? You must do these things if you're going to open your business. But we also have these in our downtown. We really want you to think about these things and stuff like that. Most people do not go very far off of bulk, you know, that kind of thing. But the council has to decide. If you want to keep them codified, then I would strongly suggest that we put a lot more specificity in these and put them in the zoning code. But some of these can't be applied, that specificity. It's a matter of taste. It's like walking through an art museum and saying, well, that looks great, and somebody else being like, I hate that, right? But I can walk in there and say, that picture is 4 by 8, and you're not allowed to hang it on that wall because it's only allowed 3 by 7. There's a difference.
And previously, council has said, we're not that kind of community. Now, this is all, I mean, Bridget could give a PhD dissertation on this, which she's sort of doing, right? There's a lot of layers, there's a lot of complexity. I know, Roger, you asked a very good question, and she gives you an answer like, oh, well, it's a good question, but the answer is pretty complex. This is all about trying to create internal consistency.
Correct.
That's what it's about. And that's why I go back to, that's why we kind of started off with the historical piece. The design guidelines are generally, I don't want to speak sort of like, I just want to speak practically. If you're going to have a historic district, maybe it makes sense to have, you know, design guidelines that are codified. Maybe. I mean, I'll give you that. What I'm saying here, if you're not doing that, then it really makes them, from a practical perspective, much more effective to be recommendations. And that's kind of what we're seeing in other communities. We try to be practical. So I guess part of what we're saying is right now, the deck of cards that you gave us, or the hand that you gave us, said no historic district. And let me just stop right there, because I was sitting in, you know, I was part of these discussions in 2009, 2010, 2011. It was very practical. It really wasn't this theoretical. We're making it much more philosophical. It was very practical. We're gonna look at $110 to $150 million new investment in downtown. So everybody's like, well, we need to help guide it, because this thing could be all over the place. I mean, can we try to narrow it down? And Ron was very much a vocal leader in that, because he's like, I'm spending 50, 60, whatever that total number is that he spent, and I don't want to spend it if other people are going to, excuse my French, you know, build crap next to me. And so you were like, we hear you, we hear you. We're in the game. We got 10 million in the game. Kent State's got 10 million in the game. We have big aspirations. This is going to be a crazy decade, and it was a crazy decade. And so those guidelines became extremely helpful, very instrumental. I mean, I can't tell you how many meetings, she's talking about the meetings that she got yelled at. You know, Mr. Burbick would call me up, and other developers, our College Town Kent, the hotel, they would call because they were bumping up against the design guidelines, but I think it worked. I mean, let's be frank, everything came out pretty darn good. Unfortunately, that era is kind of behind us. We don't have another, I would love it if someone's got plans for $110 million. But we're fairly towards the end of that reinvestment cycle. So that times have changed around us. And then, as I said, again, we're just trying to be practical. We're trying to maintain internal consistency and to stop the adjudications that you were being asked to adjudicate because of what some people thought were arbitrary interpretations by your appointees. And the risk is, and I'm not trying to overstate it, but keeping the discordant internal, or how about this way, if we keep the internal inconsistency, it's not going to be long before we're in a lawsuit. And as Hope said, you appoint the ARB. And if one of the developers, maybe Mr. Beater, maybe somebody else decides, I'm going to fight this, I'm going to sue the city over it, we're liable. We're liable. The city's liable. So we think it's important financially, too, not just to be the good business, not just to promote. I think it makes more sense. Internal consistency seems to work better for everybody. And that's kind of our theory. And so, but it also protects you from lawsuits. Again, if you don't like the endpoint we're at, we really just need to go back and revisit the historic designation thing, because it'll be a different critical path coming off that. We're on the critical path without a historical designation. If you want a historical designation, we'll need to kind of revisit this and codify and some of the questions that you're talking about. But for right now, this is what we're playing with, the cards we're playing with. That's why we're trying to sort this out and get this on track and see where you want to go with it, honestly. I mean, she spent a lot of time on this, obviously, and other staff too, but I don't want you to think it was, she's not injecting her personal opinions. She's just injecting her personal internal consistency, professional internal consistency, trying to create that.
The way that in other communities, when you look at because they do have guidelines for historic districts that are codified. Hudson does, Chagrin Falls does. Their districts were designated. And then those regulations were like, you are not allowed to tear that down if it's in this district, and it's, I think in Chagrin Falls, it's 100 years or 50 years and a designation, things like that. They have everything a lot of specificity to it. And then as the community moved forward, they would add more regulations. We're going backwards and applying something, and we don't have a district. So the challenges were intense. I mean, there was, and sometimes the requests of the Architectural Review Board made of these developers, for a developer it's time and it's money, right? They have to pay the architect to design those again. They have to delay their ability to move forward. That means the bank that's giving them their line of credit to finance the projects. I was yelled at a lot because they were told, well, we don't like the angle on that side, and then they'd have to come back in a month. So that type of giving statutory authority over something subjective for a private commercial project is a chronic conflict. We work through them, but if we're going to codify them, we should really think through that specificity.
Further from council? Anything further you want to add, Bridget?
No, I mean, I think it didn't go in necessarily order, but I definitely have covered enough. I think that it's complex. It is multi-layered, and things did not happen linear. A lot of it, and it's created a disconnect that is why you saw the two applicants come to you that were denied their certificate of appropriateness.
Mm-hmm.
Questions or comments? I'm going to go to the audience. Questions or comments from the audience? Ms. Tipton? Name and address, as you know.
Hi, I think most of you know me now. I'm Bridget Tipton. I live at 458 West Main Street. I'm probably the youngest practicing architect in Kent, maybe. I'm on the Architecture Review Board, and these are going to be my guidelines for my career here in Kent, where I intend to practice for my entire life. So, again, extremely invested in this process. A couple of things, we've covered most of the same things that I take issue with, but to reiterate the ones that, from a practitioner standpoint, that really stand out to me. The key problem, obviously, is that these are recommendations only. I don't know, as a practitioner, how morally or ethically compelled I would feel to follow any of them. I don't know, as a board member, if I would see deep value in continuing to volunteer my time. I don't know what these guidelines are going to do. Fortunately, most of the development to happen has happened, and so maybe that's going to be okay, but there isn't much in here that is going to guide or direct my practice or anyone else's, someone who cares much less about the city even than I do. They are extremely subjective still. They're possibly more subjective than the guidelines that we've been working with, which was one of the problems with them in the first place. Since they, at the moment, aren't codified and there's really no plan before us to do that, the subjectivity really doesn't matter very much. But if they were to be codified, as Bridget has said, these would be really bad ones to attempt to do that with. So these aren't that either. So if we want to move forward with an architecture review board that has a required step in the process, this wouldn't be the thing to do that with. One other thing, the overlay district in the current map or in the current document is very different than the one that you saw in May. I don't know if you all compared the two documents side by side the way that I did, but it includes a lot of additional property that wasn't included prior. I think that that's okay. It includes a ton of residential properties, which I think is a new challenge that the board hasn't necessarily been faced with. There have been some. This boundary, I think, came from public comment throughout the process, as well as like citizen input, community input, marking significant buildings on the other side of the river. That's really where the extension reaches in that map. So that's just something to be aware of. One other thing related to this, the current board is in a tricky situation. It's connected to the approval of these guidelines. So the board is supposed to be 5 members. We currently only have 4 because we stopped, you all elected or voted to stop appointing people while these guidelines were being developed. I expired a year ago. 2 more members expire at the end of this month. So we will have like 1 actual member. We've all agreed to stay on while we're in this like limbo stage. So if something kind of dramatic or whatever happens with these, like we throw them away or you go through the process of codifying them, I think something needs to be done about the composition of the board, even in the meantime, so that we know where we all stand. I think, yeah, it's been a challenge to not have a complete board. That's really we have not had a quorum a few times. I'm practicing in the city, and so I'm not allowed to represent clients or vote. And then we're down to 3. So something about that kind of needs to be solved if this becomes a more like developed process, like depending on how things go. Because it was just a vote that you all made to pause that because it looked like the end was near. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we're limping along. We need more. We need a 5th member, and the people who are expiring or have expired kind of need to be sure about what's going on with that. So that has a little bit less to do with this, but except that it's been brought up too that the composition of that board and the rights and responsibilities of that board are also up to what you all decide as well. So if we go forward with this, there are like smaller comments, but those seem really minor compared to like the bigger questions that we really have to, well, you all have to decide. But I think that's all I have for now.
Thank you. Thanks for your volunteer also. Further from audience, Mr. Fuller.
Doug Fuller. I live at 1431 River Edge Drive in Kent. And Bridget, if you're the youngest, I guess I might be the oldest registered architect, not practicing now, but could. I still have my license. So we got the youngest and the oldest here. And probably our feelings are somewhat the same. First, I got to make a couple of just general comments of things that have been said. I want you to realize that the Architectural Review Board has done a hell of a job for this community over the years. We seem to be thrown under the bus pretty easily, but believe me, you're only hearing one side of the story. If you saw some of the crap that developers, big time, Fairmonts, came in and showed to us as what they wanted to make our downtown into, you would be disgusted, and you would be thanking the Architectural Review Board for taking what wasn't a defined set of absolutes. It was a very loose-fitting set of observations about what downtown should be. We didn't have something solid. But I'll tell you, if they come back and were complaining to Bridget Sussel and Dave Roller, I'm sorry for that. But boy, I think you'd be real happy. I wish I had a copy of that stuff they originally brought in. Maybe you do.
Probably is. Well, actually, if it wasn't filmed, it probably
Yeah,
is.
right. But it was not good stuff. What we got was far, far better. And you know, I remember the first meeting we had with the Fairmont group. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not Fairmont. It was a group out of Columbus. I forget what they were building. Was it? Okay, right. And the architect came in with this stuff, and maybe I shouldn't be so hard on him. We asked him, well, have you seen the guidelines? He goes, I haven't seen any guidelines. No one showed me any guidelines. Nobody told me about any guidelines. And so, you know, it's no wonder, maybe I shouldn't be mad at them, that we got what we did. It looked more like a factory warehouse than a downtown neighborhood with using materials and rhythm of windows and storefronts. And, you know, it just didn't do that. It evolved into that. And maybe it was frustrating for them. But I say, too bad. We're Kent, Ohio, and we do have a right to have things look half decent. You don't give us the shopping mall version of what you want a downtown to be, developer. We want it to look better than that. So I tell you, there's two sides of the story on a lot of things that you hear. So, oh yeah, no, my God. You know, it is very frustrating hearing about Gary Locke's frustration. Gary Locke was invited to every meeting that the original design guidelines were developed on. He was invited to every meeting. I personally invited him to many meetings, just because he should have been there. And he never expressed anything to us about why he didn't think they were a good idea. It would have been valuable for us to have that input, but he never showed up. It's not the Architecture Review Board's fault that that happened that way. I agree with some of the problems that were in the original document, that it didn't cover what to do with new and contemporary buildings. The firm we used, forget the name already, no, but the firm we used said that the guidelines for new buildings are set really by the standards of the old buildings. Didn't mean the building had to look like it was built in 1880. It just had to use some of the same techniques, materials, windows, placements. But anyway, so, I mean, I've already said that. There's two sides to things. So I'm glad I was here to at least let you know that. Just a couple of things. And Bridget, honestly, I don't want to be...
Mr. Fuller.
I'm sorry.
You have to
I'm
address
sorry. Bridget, I don't want to be an enemy of yours. I really don't. But a couple of things in the guidelines. We heard a lot, and I came to understand, I thought, that the matter between guidelines, standards, and regulations, of whatever they're called, and I was given to believe during that process a lot of things that were going to be made into standards or regulations during this process the last couple of years. Maybe they're in there, and I apologize if they're in there and I just haven't found, but I haven't seen those things that have been taken out of design review and moved into a standard for an architect developer to say, oh, here's the rules that I'm living by. Maybe they're in there, and Bridget Susel can catch us up on that. The other is, we heard Bridget Susel say, and I agreed with her, words matter, words matter. She presented a couple of times a lawsuit that the city lost because of a word. Legal interpretation versus what we might use as a common interpretation. In the guidelines, I believe it's still, no, I believe it's in there, are listed as not mandatory. The guidelines are not mandatory. Now, if I'm a developer, I might read that very different than if I'm a local citizen, or how you might look at it. Not mandatory might mean you need to come in and talk with the Architecture Review Board. We have guidelines for you to work with. Here's some ideas in the guidelines. Work with them. They're not mandatory. We're working with you to get to a place we ought to be at. But if I'm a developer, it could say not mandatory. I don't have to listen to anything these people say, or the city says. I can build anything I want. So I do think it ought to be put in there. What does that mean, not mandatory? Oh, maybe it was intended to not mean the design guidelines don't matter at all. If that's what it means, then it's perhaps well put. But I don't think it was. I think it was meant because we have guidelines to work with the Design Review Board to go through those. There's a number of items in the guidelines that I'm hoping could be modified at some other date. As I said, I don't know if you got the letter or not, I really would hope that you don't pass them tonight so we can work on some of those details that are important. Words are important. Concepts are important. And I'll just say, I really would like the Architectural Review Board, some that have served on it for 20, 25 years, to come up and talk to you about what we do in those meetings, how much we tried to work with people. And I haven't been on the Architectural Review Board since about 2014 or something. But it was an effort to make things work when first we didn't have any guidelines at all, and then when we had guidelines, to use those to try to get something that was better. So, thank you.
Thank you. Further from the audience?
I'd like to just clarify after you're done.
Let me go back to council. Ms. Wallach?
What kind of things can be codified? I mean, you said, you know, unless something's codified, we really can't make people do things. So what kind of things?
We are requesting that the guidelines, because they are in the nature they not be codified, that they be recommendations, but we do codify things. For example, the Architectural Review Board has brought up that they don't like internally lit signs in the downtown. So we could add that as a text amendment that would go through the amendment process to Planning Commission and come to council, and it would be codified. It would basically become a zoning code requirement.
Right, I understand that. I'm just saying what things can be codified besides the things that are already
It has to be something that can actually be specifically dealt with. 30% of the glass on, you know, a square foot of 150 foot, you know, frontage needs to be glass, like that. It has to be something that we can go out there and literally measure.
Completely objective, then.
I'm sorry?
Something that's completely objective.
Correct, correct. And to address the map question, that is actually codified. It's in the zoning code. That is our overlay district. And if you look at the zoning code chapter that deals with the Architectural Review Board, residential properties are excluded from Architectural Review Board. So that is actually the overlay district that's been in the zoning code since 2011.
Ms. Wallach, further?
So I want to ask again, the overlay district, the Architectural Review Board reviews the things in the overlay district, is that it?
Correct.
And that's what the overlay district is about?
Yes.
Okay, so we still have an Architectural Review Board at present, and they
Correct.
give certificates of whatever.
Based on, the zoning code that has the guidelines. The guidelines that were currently adopted in 2011 are currently part of the zoning code. They are a requirement. They don't have specificity, but they are a requirement. And the issuance of a certificate of appropriateness by the Architectural Review Board is a requirement in the zoning code too. The project cannot move forward for any other activity until they receive that.
So if we adopt these new recommendations, will that stay the same way then?
Well, the administration is requesting that they be adopted as recommendations and the current zoning code, or the current guidelines be stricken from the zoning code. The question of then what happens with the certificate of appropriateness and the Architectural Review Board is a question that the council has to address because it is a board.
All right, I'm done.
Mr. Sidoti?
So the Architectural Review Board could continue to operate exactly the way they're operating if we so choose as a council, but they use the new,
Yes.
as their,
You are not removing that subjectivity, however.
no, I understand that.
So
Okay.
we would be in the same situation that we're currently in.
Mr. Turner?
Yeah. The elephant in the room is, in my mind now, we talk about two boards and the possible conflict that exists based on an opinion or language that you got back from some outside authority regarding their functions, unless I'm misreading that.
I'm not quite following that.
You had indicated there's the Architectural Review Board, we have another board,
Committee on Design and Preservation.
and there have been instances where the functions seem to be redundant, apparently.
No, they're not. So in other communities, the Architectural Review Board is the Committee on Design and Preservation. They are a single board. They have a historic district. They have historic requirements that are codified. Chagrin Falls, Hudson, they've had they call them different things, but it's the equivalent. We because we do not have a historic district, but in order to get the legislation, in order to move forward with the certified local government status, to get Ron Burbick the tax credits for the hotel, the city had to adopt historic preservation requirements, and SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, requires us to have a committee that deals specifically with historic. And our Architectural Review Board didn't because we didn't have historic. So we had to basically do a per property designation and set up and have the Committee on Design and Preservation. That Committee on Design and Preservation legislation is from the State Historic Preservation Office. That's what communities that have historic preservation districts use. So we have two, because the Architectural Review Board was established and given statutory authority over guidelines in 2011. But then in 2012, the community decided they did not want a historic district. But the State Historic Preservation Office requires us to have a committee that deals with historic only in order to move forward with the certified local government status. We did everything backwards.
Did that fall into then, because you're indicating that other communities actually combine that function?
They have historic preservation guidelines that
are in
right.
the ARB.
But there's a board that administers those, correct?
Okay. So the elephant in the room, I guess, is whether or not I had indicated before that those functions seem somehow to be redundant because of these things can happen with the Architectural Review Board, the historical, that was created to meet a specific need at a specific time.
Correct.
In the city's development.
Correct. In order for the city to stay a certified local government under the State Historic Preservation Office, we must keep our Committee on Design and Preservation. Because that is associated with the standards required for the Historic Preservation, State Historic Preservation Office requirements.
And I'm kind of getting, and stop me if I'm not correct, but the function seems to be now from both of those entities somewhat problematic. And quite frankly, one of the members of the Architectural Review Board said something I found kind of interesting. How are they kind of really as relevant as they were?
That's a decision for council.
How we are able to maybe there's a streamlining of the process. I'm trying to gauge what you were saying, because you had indicated we've had some issues here, not to beat up on any of the committees or, but we're not functioning perhaps to the degree that we could based on where the Architectural Review Board has had some issues that have created some hiccups. So give me a little guidance on that, because quite frankly, I'm kind of looking at that as somewhat problematic.
We are recognized by the State of Ohio Historic Preservation Office as a certified local government, which means we have the ability to facilitate and assist developers seeking state and federal tax credits, historic tax credits. In order to continue as a certified local government, which we call a CLG, we have to have a historic preservation ordinance, and we must have a committee that deals only with historic preservation. We have that in the Committee on Design and Preservation and in Chapter 1393. But because there is no established district, our historic preservation ordinance and the responsibilities of the Committee on Design and Preservation are all based on voluntary designation of a historic property by the property owner. So that committee, once we get it, they convene They consider the designation, they make a recommendation, but it's on an as-needed basis. But that is, they are needed, both that ordinance and that committee dealing with historic only, in order to stay a certified local government.
When did they butt up against one another? The architectural...
The Architectural Review Board was established before.
No, I meant, when did you had issues that you said occurred and...
Not between the two committees.
No.
Not between the two committees.
Who was it? I thought that
Developers.
there was...
Developers.
Okay, no, I don't mean the developers. There was a situation, you said that, I think at one time that somebody came in and said, some outside authority stepped in and said, well, you know, there's been a position or something that came from the Architectural Review Board and the historical group, and those kind of were in conflict. Maybe I misread that.
Yeah, no, well, the guidelines that were adopted are historic in nature, but we don't, the Architectural Review Board is not a historic preservation board. So maybe, there was a lot of complexities, there's a lot of layers to this, but I'm not sure how to clarify it, other than how I've explained it.
I'm gonna move to Ms. Schaefer-Bish, and
Yeah,
she's
I'd like
gonna
to make a motion. I would like to move that we adopt these design guidelines.
Second.
Or principles, or whatever we're going to call them, and also strike the current guidelines. Is that part of this motion?
Yes.
Okay, because we can't have two conflicting sets at the same time. And you seconded?
Yes, second. Thank you.
Okay.
Comments
Yes,
on the motion?
on the motion. Well, also on sort of all of this around the motion.
Let's kind of keep it closer.
I'm
to the
going to
motion.
try, I'm going to say that, number one, the zoning code is a living document. We can always move things that we think are appropriate to move into the zoning code, into our regulations, to tighten things up as we go forward. And I think that what we're saying is we lack a process, and that has to be an ongoing conversation, but that this is a step in that process, that this isn't over. We're not trying to solve all of these issues today. And what I like about this is the internal consistency. This also solves some issues of the questions around the Architectural Review Board that Ms. Tipton brought up, that it is kind of, it's amorphous right now. We're not sure what we're doing. That then can help us put that on the table next. So I'm just saying this is, to me, what seems to be, after a long process and a lot of clarity, thank you, Bridget, for that clarity, that it just seems to me to be the right move forward. And I know that not everybody's going to agree in this room, but I think that this opens up some additional conversations.
Ms. Rosenberg,
Sure
further
exactly what the
comments?
motion was.
The motion is to adopt these guidelines, these new guidelines, and strike or remove the ones that we are currently using.
Further comments, Mrs. Rosenberg?
Do we need an emergency?
Yeah, with emergency.
With emergency? No further, no
Okay.
comments, thank you.
Ms. Wallach?
Yeah, I'm going to vote against the adoption of the new guidelines because it just seems like there needs to be more merging of the old guidelines and the new guidelines, according to Ms. Tipton, what I've heard her say. She prefers the old ones better, so maybe a better merging. I understand that the new ones could be made as a recommendation instead of a, what was it that you said? Yeah, recommend.
Rather than a requirement.
Right, requirement, but it seems like the two have not been melded together as best as they can be, so I'm going to vote no.
Further from council? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no.
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 2 noes. Motion passes. Thank you. And that will conclude the Land Use Committee. Thank you for everybody's time and comments.
Ms. Jones?
Okay.
Thank you.
County defenders, public defenders?
This time every year, I always come back to you and ask that we renew the city's agreement with the Portage County Public Defender's Office. And this agreement allows us to pay the Public Defender's Office for any of the defendants on any city criminal case that are indigent. And we are required to do that by law.
Questions? Seeing none, anyone in the audience? Back to council.
Move to approve.
With emergency.
Second.
Further discussion?
No.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes. Thank you. There we go. Rhonda? We got this.
What time
book.
is it? 8:30?
Maybe we should have Hope present it. Hers only took a minute. Well, we're back with the operating budget, and a lot of this already, some of the details, this would certainly have already come out even during our capital discussions, because there really is they're very interconnected. So, things like water rates 3%, sewer rates 3%, those things were already broached and raised in the last conversation with the capital. They're reflected in this budget. I know over the course, probably the last 9 months, at various times, I've kind of said, as we're heading into this next year, we're really going to have to address employee retention, attraction, and so some of that meant higher pay raises than typically we've seen, but competitive. I mean, not out of the comparison data set, but higher than what we've normally done, and that's reflected in this budget. I think I've said to you too that we try to be practical and opportunistic, and this is an opportunity right now where we have had a couple of surprisingly better years than projected. Now, granted, we tend to project conservatively, but still, we had better than projected income taxes for the last couple of years, so that gave us kind of this pool of cash to apply towards some of those needs that I've said have kind of gone for a couple of years. I mean, there were some years, and